Good evening and welcome to this edition of Tok Piksa. While the past 2 months have seen the onset of a much-needed wet season in various areas around the country, there are still people in rural isolated areas who have survived the drought only to be left with little to no food at all and 7 or more months to get through before their garden crops are ready for harvesting again. Tonight we feature agriculturalist and drought advisor Dr. Mike Bourke. He gives us an update on what we should be expecting into the first half of this year. And later on in the show we speak to Sally Lloyd, an Australian missionary who grew up in Mogulu in the Western Province. Sally tells us about the local Bedamuni tribe, a people she calls her family. These people are now seeing more and more deaths from hunger and exhaustion. These deaths could increase if nothing is done to provide them food relief and specialist advice in the next few months. Dr. Mike Bourke, thank you for your time tonight on Tok Piksa.
Thanks, Noel. Nice to be here.
Okay. So we had a chat towards the end of last year, and we spoke about some of the issues related around the drought that's still running. And even though we've seen some rains that have happened over the past couple of weeks, we can't settle back and think that the problem's over.
Yeah, the rain has been very useful in particularly much of the country, toward the north of the country, in the island region and much of Mamasi. It's been very useful because essentially it's been a water supply problem as much as a food problem there. What's happening in the Central Highlands and the main highland valleys and on the edges of the highlands, people are replanting now. Lots of reports from all around the highlands and the edge of the highlands of people replanting. There's still a while before the cow comes in. People are starting to eat greens again. Some markets have got good food already. Other markets there's virtually no cow or potato or carbohydrate food, taro or even banana. There's also an issue in the highlands with some of the potatoes. After a drought, there's a tendency when you plant a crop of cow is to get very lush top growth. There's too much nitrogen, and then no tuber growth. And we're starting to see evidence of that at the moment from Nondagul and Jiwaka and elsewhere, just like in the beginning of the end of the 97 drought, so 1998 we saw that. So that's in the highlands. As we go south in the country, the southern part of Western, and I suspect I haven't got the most recent information from south of Milne Bay, but certainly in the very southern part of Western, where Indonesia, Australia and Papua New Guinea all meet, still very dry. So very, very dry down the south of the country, and that's where the biggest issues are at the moment in terms of food and other issues.
Now with the rains is also the problem of insects infestation.
We're getting a lot of insect infestation this time, even before the rain came. It's certainly with the rain level. A lot of reports from all around the highlands, but even in the islands region and certainly in Western Province, and a lot of images. People are sending out images of a lot of insect damage. So a lot of crops are being damaged. Not sweet potato, that's a weevil problem, and that problem is solved with the rain, but of course there's no new tubers at the moment where the frost and drought have been. But that problem will disappear with the cracks in the soil closing up with the cow. But with a lot of the vegetables at the moment, there's a lot of reports of crops being damaged. Even cassava, tapioca, which is unusual. Haven't had that in the past. But a lot of reports of insects doing a lot of damage, yeah.
And crops like sago, who have needed water, and during the dry period, people find it difficult to rely on that.
Yes, and that's been the issue. And a lot of people have not been able to process sago. Some people can, and they've had to go to quite extraordinary lengths, digging wells and using dirty water and what have you. Where there's been reasonable rain, that problem's being solved, but again in the far south of Western Province, that's not solved because there's been insufficient water. In other parts of the country, for example, up in other parts of Western, up in the Strickland area, Strickland, Nomad, Mogulu area, some of the sago has been exhausted. They're banana growing people basically, and people have used up their limited sago stocks. But for a lot of people in the sago growing areas, things are coming back to normal fairly rapidly. Within a few weeks of getting good rain, they can then process the sago again.
So is the worst behind us?
The worst at the national level is, but for those people who are most impacted, particularly, again, I come back to southern and central Western Province, very clear indications that the death rate has risen, very strong indications from a number of locations in all remote, very, very remote places. We're talking about the far east of Western Province, or the eastern side of it, up where it borders Hela and Southern Islands, and the far south, basically where Indonesia, Queensland and Papua New Guinea meet. It's that corner. So for those locations, the death rate's already gone up. It is quite possible it will keep rising for a while. That was the pattern in early '98 after the drought in these remote places. The same applies in some remote parts of Gulf, where Gulf, Eastern Highlands and Morribee meet, that corner, but more on the Gulf side, the southern side of the ranges rather than more so than the Morribee and the Eastern Highlands side. As a country at a national level, yes, its worst is behind people, particularly, of course, for many people this is about water and school closure, so that's behind people. I've got mail coming in from colleagues in New Ireland, for example. All the schools there are expected to open on time at the end of January, beginning of February. Water supply is back to normal. Food in the market is a bit expensive still, but it's starting to come back in as the new crops come in. So for much of the country, yes, the worst is behind people, but again, in certain pockets of the country, I keep coming back to these same locations, people are still got very big problems, very serious problems.
Okay. Now, we've heard some talk about the dry season. There's a possibility it could continue to June or July. Should we be concerned?
Well, certainly, we can't predict. I mean, what people are talking about is the El Nino, and we can't, so the El Nino is certainly going to continue. All the experts tell us at least till May, maybe even June, July. But the El Nino is a global change in wind and then rainfall patterns, etc. How that affects a particular place in Papua New Guinea is harder to predict, the highlands or the island region or the southern region, etc. But the indications at the moment, the El Nino is continuing. I mean, in Port Moresby at the moment, as we speak, it's mid-January, and the winds are blowing from the southeast. That is not normal. Normally by now you've got a northwest wind and it's wet. So this coast, up and down the coast in central, and the southern region is still quite dry. So certainly we're still in a strong El Nino pattern, even if it is weakening at the moment. So these issues could continue for quite a few months. Of course, the other issue, Neville, of course, the period from when you plant to when you harvest. With cow in the highlands, we're talking about 4, 5, 6 months longer at very high altitude where people are hit by the frost above 2,000, above 2,200 metres in parts of Anga, much of Anga, parts of Anga, little bits of the southern highlands, parts of western highlands and parts of Hela where the frost was very severe. Those issues are going to go for a long time. So just because of the growing period of cow as much as anything.
Okay. So we shouldn't let our guard down. Do our people need food? Is that what's happening now?
The common denominator, the common factor in all these places where people need the greatest help is they're remote, and it's extremely expensive to get there. I mean, it depends how you transport it and all the rest, exact details, but you're talking about if it's a couple $100 a tonne, a couple $1,000 a tonne to buy rice, it can be many thousands of dollars a tonne to actually transport it, particularly using light aircraft like a Twin Otter, and choppers are even more expensive. And yes, people definitely need food, and particularly in that very far south of Western Province, Moorhead, through to Oriomo Plateau, north to Suki. In the eastern part of that province, we're talking about the Strickland through to Nomad, through to Mogaloo, and that's through to the border with Southern Highlands and Eastern Highlands, Southern Highlands and Hela, I mean. So that region, those two regions, that inland part of Gulf, food has been delivered to the very small islands of Milne Bay by the competent provincial authorities there. They've taken food out. The authorities tell me that that food should last the people on those tiny islands through to February, which is good news. They may need more help after that, but that'll be more assessments will be needed to assess the situation. The numbers are relatively small down there. It's about 18,000 people, the provincial people estimate. In Western Province, we're talking about, of the order, from the top of my head, I think it's about 35, 40,000 people maximum who need help, smaller numbers in Gulf. The numbers are not huge, but once you start buying food and particularly transporting food, both the volumes and particularly the cost go up quite dramatically. Big dollars, big kina.
But what we're looking for here is the people need food over a long period rather than just a quick fix or a shorter period.
That's right, yes. It doesn't have to be 9 months or 6 months even, but certainly while there's a crisis and as the months go on, more crops come into bear. I think my message, Neville, is to focus on the people in the greatest need. It is not spreading rice and other aid across the whole province or a whole landscape. It is zooming on the people who have the greatest need. Many people are buying their way out of trouble. So again, if I come back to Western, I think about that because I've done a lot of work up there in the last few years. So the area, for example, from Kiunga through to Sisimarkham, Ningarum, Sisimarkham through to Booble, that corridor there, there's money. Yes, people are doing it tough. It's getting better now with the rain. People can now process sago. Bananas will be starting to grow again. But at least there's some money in the system and there's money flows in the market. There's ways of getting a little bit of money. It's these remote places that are virtually outside the cash economy, and that's my message is that's where the focus has to be, on these people who are very remote and really get very little assistance from anyone. And they're very hard to get to. It's very expensive. They're airstrips only. Airstrips, it's too far to walk. I mean, we're talking about many days walk to the nearest place where you can deliver food from a ship or anything. And that's the issue. They're remote and it is expensive.
Yeah. Now, would you have any words of advice of sorts to the people who are living in remote areas or who are living in areas where the rains have come and crops, it's starting to look greener?
I think in the highlands in particular, Neville, there's two issues. One is to keep an eye out on the cacao crops. If they're producing a lot of green growth and no tubers, the best thing is to get rid of those crops. They're not going to produce anything. It's too late. Rip them out and start again. So you've lost 2 months, whatever. But you've got to replant, and there's a soil, because you've got a big flush of nutrients in the soil after the drought, and that gives you too much top growth. So, but if you pull that crop out, dispose of it, replant again, then you'll come back to your normal pattern. And we saw that very clearly in 1998. The other issue is in the highlands again, is to maintain your planting rate. What we've seen in the past, when food is short, the ladies plant a lot more crop. The planting rate can go as high as almost 200 square metres per woman per week. The long-term average is about 50 square metres. So it goes up dramatically. The men folk are also clearing grasslands or forests, so the ladies are planting at a better quality land. Now this results in a boom crop the following year. The men stop clearing, the ladies drop their planting rate, can go as low as 20 square metres, right down from 200 right down to 20, and then you have a second time hungry. So the message is keep up a steady planting rate. Just get the system moving again, because you've got to move. You don't store these crops, they're stored in the ground, and so just keep up when I say a steady planting rate, we're not talking about 50 square metres or 60 every single week, but more or less the same. You don't go to very big highs and then very big lows, because if you do that, there's a high probability you get a second time hungry. And we've seen that historically. When you look at the historical record in the highlands, typically you get a time hungry caused by a drought or a frost, and typically a little bit less than 2 years later, you have a second time hungry with no apparent cause. And the real cause is actually these cycles in the planting rate. So the message is keep your planting rate steady and just get the system working again, so you get a throughput of food just coming through at a steady rate.
Okay. Do we have concerns in the future if we have an extra amount of rainfall after the dry period?
Certainly, yes, and this is a common pattern. We can't say it's going to happen, but it's a common pattern for an El Nino, which has caused this. It's the climatic perturbation, is the technical term, I guess, a climatic problem, followed a dry period for our part of the world, the Western Pacific, followed by a very wet period, and that caused a new set of problems. I'm not predicting that, but it certainly has been a common pattern, too dry and then too wet. And too wet, particularly for cacao. Cacao is a tough crop. It's a very tough crop, but it is vulnerable to being too wet. If it's too wet after the ladies plant the planting vines, then there's a tendency for not to get a sufficient tubers, and that's something to keep an eye on. All the places that I'm talking about now where people are doing it really tough, where the death rate is going up and may well rise again, the common denominator is not whether you live on cacao or banana or saksak. The common denominator is that you are remote and don't have money. Most of the extra rice this year will rise somewhere between 35 and 40%, just like it did in 97, 98. It increased by just under 40%, and we're seeing a very similar pattern. So rice imports are probably going to be of the order of 300,000 tonnes. And most of that rice is being bought by ordinary people, mum and dad in the village, sometimes with money from the urban one talks. It's where people have got development, they're buying their way out of trouble. So much of the Central Highlands or the islands or anywhere where there's development from agriculture or near the urban areas, people can solve their own problems with money. So it's these places that are not developed, that remain underdeveloped, that are so isolated still, that's where people are in trouble now. So it's the development the long-term development that PNG's enjoyed for the last 60 years, that's what's helping people survive this, most people survive this at the moment.
Are people resilient?
Oh, very much so.
Will be able to see through the year?
Most people, but there is a spike in death rate. I mean, last time, Neville, in some remote parts in Gulf, 7% of the population died. These are remote, these are small populations, but of course if you live in that community it's devastating. And What shocked me at the time was not the older people, not your 50-year-old, 55-year-old, or not your under fives. It was what PNG English people sometimes call middle age, 25 to 40, before you turn grey. Those 15, 20 years when you're most productive, both your family responsibilities, your economic responsibilities, before people might start to slow down a little bit and start to, their grandkids are coming along, etc. That's what shocked me, was men and women dying in that period. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. That's what's raising alarm bells with me at the moment. Reports of 25-year-olds, 28-year-olds, 32-year-olds, men and women dying, and that rings alarm bells. That's not a stage in life when many people die. It's not common. People die when they're older, when they're very young, but not in those years. And that's what we're seeing in a few remote places. So yes, people are resilient, but if you don't have food, then it's tough. The other issue that happens when it's very dry is you get an increase in disease burden. So particularly malaria. As the streams stop flowing, the mosquitoes can build up and you get more malaria. The malaria tends to move into higher altitude on the edge of the highlands, and that's where we're getting reports at the moment, increased malaria. More diarrhoea, more dysentery, and skin diseases and gut diseases. So you put that disease burden on top of inadequate nutrition, or people living on food that is not balanced, like sack, just living on sago only. Sago on its own is an extremely unbalanced food. You can't live on that on a long-term basis. You need other food to balance it. And that's what's happening at the moment. People are surviving and keeping alive on sago, but you don't have a balanced diet. And then you put a disease burden on top of that, and that's what then starts to push up greater incidence of disease and the long-term issues.
Okay. Dr. Bourke, you're still involved a lot in drought work here, in providing advice about drought, and you'll be here in Mosby more often this year?
Yes. I'm working with a whole different groups at the moment, including different churches, PNG government, and some of the overseas donors and what have you, development partners. I'm working with quite a range of groups. My situation is I know PNG extremely well. I've been virtually everywhere. I know the bush very well, so I can interpret information as it comes in, what it means, and then help people that don't know the country so well with those geographic patterns. But also because I've been here so long, and particularly I've been through 72 drought. I was young and inexperienced, but 82 wasn't a big deal, but I was here. But certainly in 97, 98, I was very involved, so I know what's happened in the past. I also did my doctoral degree on cause of time hungry in the Highlands, so I know the historical material going right back to 1914, when there was a very major drought in PNG then. So that's sort of what I bring to the table, I guess, and I can help both the Papua New Guinea government and the churches and the development partners with that. So yeah, I'm still very engaged with this. It's my small contribution to helping people, I guess.
So throughout this year, we hope to have a chat again and have you back on Tok Piksa.
Happy to be back, Neville, yes.
Dr. Mike Bourke, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Neville. Yeah.
Welcome back to Tok Piksa. Our next and final segment tonight features Sally Lloyd. Sally is the daughter of Evangelical Church of PNG missionaries. She grew up in rural Western Province and speaks the local Bedamuni language fluently. Recently, she returned to the area and saw the dire circumstances the people were in after having to deal with a strong El Nino. To Sally, the Bedamuni are family. Sally tells us more about her family and the kind of help they urgently need just to survive. Good evening, Sally, and thank you for joining us on Tok Piksa.
Thank you, Neville. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. Yeah.
Tell us about what you did there.
Okay, I've actually been in Papua New Guinea since 1968 when I came with my family. So the people in that part of Western Province are my family, and I, as well as growing up there, I keep coming back as often as I can to spend some time with them. And during the time of independence, I was here and we began to see the effects of the drought starting, including no market foods and things like that. So I came back this time to spend some time with them, but also to try and find out the real situation and try and get some photographic evidence and things like that of how they were going, because they had no help so far.
And what were the signs, besides the markets running out of or low on food and garden food, because agriculture is a mainstay, I assume? Yeah,
agriculture is the only source of income and providing for their families. So all of them are farmers. There's no stores, roads, any kind of transport where they are, so they're just providing, subsistence farmers. In September and October, they'd had almost no rain for many, many weeks, and the ground was very dusty and dry. It's usually a very high rainfall area, was really dusty and dry. And some places the ground had started to split open, like big cracks in the ground, and we've never seen that before in all that time. So that was obviously a serious sign of water shortage, and at that time the crops were failing. So they'd virtually exhausted their current food at that time. In around September and October, there was very little to eat at that time.
Were there any other mitigating measures that the communities could work on?
Not really. They rely very heavily on water. Banana is their staple food, so you need a lot of water to grow good bananas. And sago is their other food, and as the water began to dry, then they couldn't produce sago as easily. So, there's not really a lot that they could do without water for their gardens. The soil is... it's rainforest sort of soil where they've cut down for their garden, so the soil's not overly productive, very good for growing bananas, but without the water there's not very much that they can do. And they certainly don't have any access to any other kind of food like, rice or store foods like that, so really there wasn't a lot they could do at that stage.
And how did you feel that you could help them?
We had hoped at that stage that relief would come soon, some food relief would come soon, and I guess I wasn't sure if there was a lot I could personally do. And then as time went on and they would ask for help, because no food relief had arrived and their gardens were even worse, that was when I thought, maybe I should come and see how they were really doing. So.
Tell us about the people that live where you visited.
Okay. The people, the tribal group is called the Bedamini group, and they actually were first contacted in the late 60s, so they were on a government restricted list, very last contacted people group. It was quite dangerous to go there when my family went, so they really were only contacted just before independence, and since that time they've had very little development or anything happening for them other than mission, development. So they're very, they've had not as much opportunity as a lot of places in Papua New Guinea in many areas like education and health and things like that. Surrounding the Bedamini tribe where I grew up, there's a number of other small tribes, Samoa, Kubo, various other tribes of people, and they're in much the same position that, they've had very little in the way of development or services or things like that. They do have some aid posts that have been mission established aid posts in schools. But they're wonderful people, and they're like my family, very generous, kind people. Unlike the earlier reports of what kind of people they were, I'm certainly not afraid of them. They're very genuine, kind people. Sometimes they're a bit inclined not to sing out and let people know that they need a hand. So they tend to be very quiet and if you go there, they'll bring you food even if they have nothing. So they're not jumping up and down. And I guess that's one thing that I thought I could help with, is to raise some awareness about their situation.
And obviously there's been some rains in recent weeks, but that is not the end of the problem.
There has been some rain, nowhere near enough. For them to receive 40 millimetres in 2 or 3 weeks is nowhere near what they require. So the rainfall is usually very high every day. They get really big rains. The place is running with water normally. So the rain has been nowhere near enough. It's been enough to promote a little bit of growth. That growth, though, is usually like green. There's not a lot of productive food coming with the growth of the plants. Some areas have still received no rain, so I'm not just looking at the Bedamini people, but trying to see other areas in the Western Province and certainly down in the South Fly. Some areas there we understand have had no rain yet, and they're really struggling. For the Badamini though, they've had a little bit of rain, but now we're seeing some really severe problems with insect infestation, with larvae eating out the base of their banana trees, pumpkins being destroyed. Like any food that they are able to produce, a lot of it is being infested with insects, or rats are eating a lot of it, you know, before it matures. So they're having those problems. And as well as that, of course, you know, a banana's not going to grow overnight when the rain comes. So we're looking at you know, 3, 6, 9 months before the food that they do manage to grow is going to be ready, depending on what type of food it is. So, you know, there's still a long way to go. And the people are quite frustrated and, you know, just wondering why. They call themselves the forgotten people, and you know, I think that explains how they feel, and I think it also explains a little bit how they are. You know, it's quite true that they're over there in that corner and out of the way. So it's yeah, it's very difficult for them to understand why no help has been coming for them.
Mm-hmm. And what help, if we could just quantify exactly what kind of help they really need right now, and for at least for the next 6 to 8 months?
Yeah, look, they just need food. You know, they need some help to, you know, to get through, to be able to feed their children. They need some food coming into the area, some basic food, and then on an ongoing basis they need some help with, you know, maybe what's causing some of the insect damage and some of the problems. But first priority, I think, really is food. You know, there's some areas, particularly as you head from where I grew up at Mogaloo down towards Nomad River, where they've had nothing but sago since September or earlier, and the sago's running out. You know, they've used up even the young trees now. So there's some people down there who've really got nothing to eat. And you know, down there we've seen a number of deaths. At Mogaloo was also due to the being hungry, really. So that's a concern, because I think as the rain returns, people will go into their gardens. They'll try and work hard to plant crops, but they're weak and, you know, they're not strong, and that's when normally the death rate would start to climb from now.
And to put into context, what's the population of the area?
The Badamini people themselves is around 13,000 people.
Okay.
They're scattered in very sparse villages around the area. Some of those villages I visited, and the story's the same everywhere, although some places are worse than others, obviously. Some of the surrounding tribes are small in number, you know, 3,000 to 5,000, things like that. So it's not a massive population by any means. It's doubled or more than doubled since we first went there, the population. You know, obviously through better health and things like that, but yeah.
Okay. Well, hopefully we can amplify your call here for some kind of help to the Badamini people.
Thank you.
And to the rest of the people in Western Province who don't have access to government services or advice that could really help them during this time.
Yes, thank you, Neville. I think their isolation and their poverty is the key factor in the, missing out on getting the assistance. So it's really important.
Sally, Lloyd, thank you very much for your time on Tok Piksa.
Thanks, Neville. Right. Thank you.
The people in isolated rural areas of the Western Province need help. They need food relief, and they need it now. I'm Neville Choi, and this has been Tok Piksa. We'll do this again next Sunday. Good night.